Well, welcome everyone to our latest edition of Stories for Healing. Remember, we started this back in October, and here we are in the new year, still going strong. And that's the good news and the bad news, because the good news is we're still going strong, and storytellers from around the world are coming with their stories of healing. And the bad news is we still need it. We still need it badly. And I will tell you, as a storyteller, and I know I share this with our community, that we get as much out of this as you do. So it's really wonderful that this is continuing and that we continue to hear stories of healing and transformation together. Today, I'm really pleased to have back Kristin Pedemonti, who has been a storyteller with us before and is about to tell us another story. So, Kristin, please tell us a story.
Thank you so much, Jim. Always a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm really grateful for the transformational storytelling that you've been sharing. As you said, we've needed it and we still do. So I want to take you all to Nigeria, and this is a traditional Yoruba tale called The Greatest Gift. Chief Oba called in his favorite servant. My friend, I've got a question for you. I am wondering if you would be willing to go on a quest to find the greatest gift that God Obatala has given to humans. Are you willing? The servant looked at the chief and said, "Oh, yes, sire, anything that you request, anything you desire, I am willing to go." And with that, the servant set out on the journey. He walked out across the plains. He spoke to the men who were hunting the animals, to the women who were collecting the fruits. He even spoke to the animals themselves. But he had not yet discovered the greatest gift that God Obatala had given. And so he hiked up the top of the tallest mountain. He sat and he meditated. He listened to the wind. He listened to the birds. But he had not yet discovered the greatest gift that God Obatala had given. And so he hiked down the other side of that mountain, across another plain, all the way to the river. He spoke to the men who were casting out the fishing nets, the women doing laundry on the bankside. He even spoke to the fish themselves. And then he discovered it, the greatest gift that God Obatala had given. And with a joyful heart, he practically ran across that plain, up the mountain, down the other side, across the savannah, back to the home of the chief. The servant burst through the door, and the chief looked at him and he said, "Oh my goodness, you look so excited. What is it? What have you discovered?" "Oh, sire, it is wonderful. The greatest gift that God Obatala has given is the tongue." And the chief looked at him and said, "The tongue? Oh, yes. Well, with the tongue, we can speak words of kindness and words of love. We can work our way into someone's heart and live there forever. And the elders, they can share their story and knowledge with the next generation, and then they learn, and this continues." And the chief smiled and said, "This is a great gift indeed." And then the chief paused and thought for a moment. "I'm wondering, are you willing to go on another quest? On another quest to discover the most negative, the most awful thing that God Obatala has given to humans? This knowledge might be very useful for us." This time the servant paused and thought for a moment. "Yes, yes, anything you desire. Yes, sire, I am willing to go on that quest as well." And once again the servant set out. He walked out across that grassy plain. He spoke to the men hunting the animals, to the women collecting the fruits from the trees, and once again to the animals themselves. But he had not discovered the most awful negative thing that God Obatala had given. And so he hiked up the top of that tallest mountain. And once again, he sat and he meditated. He listened to the wind, he listened to the birds, but he had not discovered the most negative thing that God Obatala had given. And so he hiked down the other side of that mountain, all the way across that next grassy plain to the river. And once again, he spoke to the men casting out their fishing nets, the women doing laundry on the bankside, and he even spoke to the fish. And then finally, he discovered it, the most negative, awful thing that God Obatala had given to humans. And this time, with a heavy heart, he walked slowly back across that plain, up the mountain, down the other side, across the next grassy savanna, all the way back to the home of the chief who was waiting for him. He welcomed the servant in and said, "You look so heavy, so sad. What is it? What have you discovered?" And the servant said, "Sire, it's awful. The most negative thing that God Obatala has given to humans is the tongue." The chief looked at him and he said, "The tongue? I thought you said this was the greatest gift." "Yes, but it's the most awful as well." "Well, how can that be so?" "Because some people with the tongue, they speak words of gossip and words of hatred. Hatred that goes so deep, sometimes it breaks someone's heart into so many pieces, it might never be repaired. And the elders, they can't share their story with the next generation because sometimes that hatred, it grows and it spreads and there is war. And the young go off and fight, and some of them die." The chief looked at the servant once again and he said, "I'm still confused. I don't understand. How can it be that the tongue is both the most negative thing and the most positive thing that God Obatala has given?" And the two of them sat and they thought and they thought until finally the servant smiled and said, because God Obatala not only gives us the tongue, he gives us a mind with which we can choose how we use the tongue." And the chief smiled and said, "Ah, yes, and may we all choose wisely." Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, a great story. How did you first come across that story? Do you remember?
It was when I was a children's librarian, and this was back in the mid 90s, and I fell in love with the 398.2 part of the library and every library. I already had a pretty deep relationship, and then it was like love. And I believe that this was in a collection put together by Len Cabral. I
Okay.
believe it was in a collection he put together. And it's a public, what I do know is it is a public domain story. I made sure that I wasn't taking someone's story that I shouldn't take.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I believe that was the collection that I found it in. And I've recently tried to refine that collection. And it's a bit challenging as sometimes
Sure.
things are.
Yeah.
So um, I believe that's where I found it. And it wasn't Len's story. It was a collection of world tales that he had put
Okay.
together.
Okay.
So and again, it was public domain. This is a story that you're welcome to tell.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and it's one of the truths that is emerging for me in this process is that, the older stories that we encounter and tell and hear, that have difficulties in them are really the stories that are, I think, if we're going to talk about authentic, I think they're the
Yeah.
authentic ones. And they're the ones that really speak to us most deeply because, it isn't a world of all happy endings and easy paths. And we don't need to learn about those. We need to learn about the difficulties and how we move through them and with them. So very much appreciate the
Absolutely.
stories. Very much appreciate.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
So I want to thank you all for coming to this episode of Stories for Healing. I want to remind you that you can share these videos. They're both on Facebook and on YouTube. Please share them. Um, Share what you've learned. And, share the ability to look at the world in more than one way. And the only way to do that is to do it with someone else because they're the best source of another way of looking at the world. So until the next time, uh, be well and be safe. And this is Stories for Healing. Thanks.